She found the key in his cold hand, not his room key, but the key to a door that had been locked for 30 years. Outside, the snow was still falling, quiet as a secret, covering everything. Welcome to Mystery Stories, where every shadow hides a secret, and every cup of tea may be your last. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Last Train to Wilverstone. The train from London had been delayed by 40 minutes, and then by another 20, and by the time it finally pulled into Wilverstone halt, the sky had turned that particular shade of pewter that means snow is not merely coming, but is already decided. Miss Jane Marple stood on the platform with her small brown suitcase and her large black handbag, and she looked up at the sky the way a farmer looks at it, not dramatically, but with a steady, practical assessment of what was to come. Snow. Quite a lot of it. Before morning, she had not intended to come to Wilverstone at all. The original plan had been Exeter, to visit her niece Marjorie, who had a new baby and an old house and a persistent problem with the boiler. But Marjorie's letter had arrived with a postscript that said the baby had croup, the boiler had packed up entirely, and perhaps Aunt Jane might wait until February. February. Miss Marple had considered that for a moment. February was a long way off. It was her doctor's suggestion, ultimately, that she come to the Pelham Inn. Dr. Haydock, the retired one, not the young new man with the stethoscope that swung about in a rather alarming way, had said that cold air and rest were precisely what she needed after that dreadful bout of bronchitis in November. He had spoken of the Derbyshire hills as though they were medicine. He had been quite firm about it. So here she was. Wilverstone halt. A platform, a wooden shelter with a broken bench, and a view of nothing in particular except dark fields, and the beginning of something white falling from the sky. The taxi driver was a man of very few words, which Miss Marple rather appreciated after the noise of London. His name, according to a small laminated card on the dashboard, was Harold Fitch. He drove with the deliberate confidence of a man who has navigated these roads in worse than this, and he smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco and diesel. The Pelham Inn, he told her, was 2 miles up the valley and then left past the church. Full up, they are, he said, after a pause that lasted precisely long enough for the snow to begin settling on the windscreen wipers. There's a conference. Businessmen from Sheffield. Another pause. And 1 or 2 others. Oh, said Miss Marple pleasantly. How interesting. Harold Fitch said nothing further, which Miss Marple found even more interesting. The Pelham Inn appeared out of the darkness like something from a Christmas card that has been left out too long and grown a little worn at the edges. It was a proper old inn, low ceilings, pale stone, windows the color of honey from the lamplight inside. A sign swung above the door with a pelican on it, though the bird had lost most of its gilding and now appeared to be simply a large pale bird with opinions. The door opened before Miss Marple could reach for the handle, and a woman of perhaps 55 stood in the light with the expression of someone who has been expecting you, possibly longer than you have been expecting yourself. Miss Marple, I'm Dorothy Pelham. We spoke on the telephone. She took the suitcase with a single clean movement. Come in quickly. The snow's coming properly now. Inside, the Pelham Inn smelled of wood smoke and old stone and something baking that involved both cinnamon and butter. There was a low beam immediately upon entering, which Dorothy Pelham ducked under without thinking, and which Miss Marple noted carefully. The hall opened into a sitting room where a fire was burning with real conviction. 3 armchairs faced it. 2 were occupied. A man of about 60, heavy-set, with the kind of face that has seen more disappointments than surprises, looked up from a newspaper that he had not, Miss Marple suspected, been reading. And beside the window, though there was nothing to see through it now except darkness and snow, sat a young woman of about 27, with very pale hair and very still hands. That's Mr. Orwell Crane, Dorothy Pelham said quietly, and somehow managed to make the introduction feel as though she were describing weather conditions. And Miss Celia Vane. Neither of them spoke. Orwell Crane nodded once. Celia Vane looked at her hands. Miss Marple smiled at them both with the particular warmth she reserved for people who appeared to have something very much on their minds. She settled into the third armchair and accepted the cup of tea that appeared with remarkable speed, and she looked at the fire, and she listened to the snow beginning its long work outside. There were other guests, she would learn. But for now, there were just these two. This fire. And the feeling, quite specific and not at all comfortable, that someone in this pleasant old inn was already frightened of something. Chapter 2. The Guests at the Pelham. By dinner, the snow had made its intentions very clear. It was coming down in the kind of steady, serious way that does not announce itself and does not stop. Dorothy Pelham mentioned at precisely 7 o'clock that the road to Wilverstone was already impassable, and that the main road through the valley would likely follow by morning. She said this the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, without drama, and in a way that left no room for complaint. The dining room was small and low and warm. A single long table of dark oak ran down the center, flanked by mismatched chairs that had been gathered over many years and many different owners. Above it hung a chandelier of iron that held 8 candles, all of them real. Miss Marple counted the guests as they arrived. Orwell Crane came first, precisely at 7, and sat with the manner of a man claiming territory. He was followed by Celia Vane, who sat as far from him as the table allowed, which at the Pelham was not very far at all. Then came a couple, Gerald and Harriet Broom, who were celebrating what Gerald called our anniversary and Harriet called Gerald's excuse to get out of London. They were pleasant and loud and immediately at ease in the way that people who are used to other people's company tend to be. After them came a man who introduced himself as Dr. Anton Feist. He had a very precise beard and very imprecise eyes, the kind that move about a room without appearing to settle anywhere in particular, taking everything in while pretending to take nothing in at all. He was from the conference in Sheffield, he said, though he said it in the way that suggests the true answer is more complicated. The last to arrive was a young man called Theo. He gave no surname. Dorothy Pelham seemed to know who he was without needing one, and she set his place at the far end of the table near the door to the kitchen. Theo was perhaps 22 or 23. He had the look of someone who has been outdoors a great deal and indoors reluctantly. His hands were weathered for his age. He ate with the speed and silence of someone who has learned that food is practical rather than social. Miss Marple sat between the Brooms and observed everything. Harriet Broom was the sort of woman who notices what other women are wearing and files it away without any particular malice, simply as data. She noticed that Celia Vane's dress was expensive, but not new. She noticed that Dr. Feist had changed for dinner and that the change involved a good deal of cologne. She noticed Miss Marple noticing things and smiled at her with the warm recognition of one observer greeting another. "Dreadful weather for it," Harriet said, gesturing at everything, "but actually rather nice. Don't you think? All stuck here together, like those mystery novels." She said this brightly and without irony. Gerald Broom, who was working his way through the lamb stew with considerable focus, said and reached for the bread. Dorothy Pelham's cooking, Miss Marple had already decided, was the kind that does not draw attention to itself but simply works. The stew was exactly what stew should be. The bread was still warm from the oven. The butter had been left out just long enough to be soft. Conversation moved in the comfortable, erratic way of dinner, among strangers who find themselves more at ease than expected. The Brooms talked about London. Dr. Feist mentioned a paper he was to present in Sheffield. Orwell Crane said very little and ate methodically. Celia Vane ate almost nothing and appeared to be listening to the space between other people's words. Only once did anything cut through the social warmth of the room. It was when Gerald Broom asked, quite innocently, whether anyone else had noticed the old photograph in the hall, the one above the boot rack, of a man standing in front of what appeared to be the inn itself, some years back. "That's my grandfather," Dorothy Pelham said from the doorway where she had appeared with a dish of apple crumble. "Edwin Pelham, He built the east wing. It was not what she said that made the room shift slightly. It was that Orwell Crane put down his fork at the mention of the name. Just for a moment. And then picked it up again. Celia Vane, Miss Marple noticed, had been watching Orwell Crane. And Theo, at the end of the table, appeared very suddenly to need something from his jacket pocket, and looked at neither of them. Miss Marple helped herself to apple crumble and found it very good. Chapter 3. What the Snow Covers. Morning came slowly, as mornings do when there has been snow in the night. The light that arrived through the curtains of Miss Marple's room was not the usual light. It was softer, more diffuse, and it had a quality of stillness to it that told her, before she had opened the curtains, that the world outside had been transformed. She opened them anyway. The courtyard of the Pelham Inn lay under perhaps 14 inches of snow. The stone walls had been softened to something almost gentle. The old pump in the corner wore a cap of white. The gate that led to the lane was buried to its middle hinge. No one was getting in or out today. Miss Marple dressed with her usual care, 2 cardigans, because Derbyshire in January respected no one, and went downstairs to find Dorothy Pelham already in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the dresser with the efficiency of someone who has managed emergencies before and considers this one manageable. "Good morning," Dorothy said. "Porridge or eggs? I've been up since 5. Boiler's running fine, in case you were wondering. The road won't clear until Thursday at the earliest, according to the radio. The mobile signal is unreliable, but hasn't gone entirely." "Porridge, please," said Miss Marple. "And then, if you don't mind, perhaps a little tour. I like to understand a place." Dorothy Pelham looked at her steadily. "Do you?" she said. It was not quite a question. The kitchen tour, which somehow expanded into a tour of the inn's ground floor, revealed several things. The Pelham was older than its exterior suggested. Parts of it dated from the 16th century, a fact made apparent by the way the floors moved unexpectedly, and the way certain walls were not quite at right angles to anything else. The east wing, built by Edwin Pelham in the 1920s, was noticeably different, straighter, with higher ceilings and rooms that connected without the medieval irregularity of the older parts. There was a private sitting room off the main hall that Dorothy kept locked. "Family papers," she said, in a tone that ended the subject. There was a cellar that smelled of old wine and older stone. There was a garden that was completely invisible under the snow, though Dorothy could describe exactly what lay beneath: a rose bed, a kitchen garden, an apple tree that had been there longer than the inn. And there was Edwin Pelham, looking out from the photograph in the hall, with his heavy coat and his confident stance, and the faintest suggestion of something complicated about his expression. "He built the east wing in 1923, Dorothy said, coming to stand beside Miss Marple. "Added 6 rooms in the stable block. He was a businessman. He had interests. The pause before a businessman was very small. The pause after interests was not. A prosperous man," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "For a time," Dorothy said. In the sitting room, Orwell Crane was already installed with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper, though he was no more reading it than he had been the night before. He looked up when they passed the doorway, and his eyes went immediately to the photograph in the hall, even though he could not quite see it from where he sat. He knew exactly where it was, Miss Marple noted. He had been looking at it. Perhaps more than once. Celia Vane came downstairs at 9:30 with the careful movements of someone who has not slept well and is trying not to show it. She poured herself tea from the pot on the sideboard and stood at the window looking at the snow. "It's rather beautiful," she said, to no one in particular. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It covers a great deal very effectively." Celia Vane turned and looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Not alarm, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though a door had been opened that she hadn't expected to find. Then Theo came down, smelling of cold air and engine oil, which meant he had been out to the stable block, and the moment passed. Chapter 4. The Man in Room 7. It was Dorothy Pelham who found him, at 10:30 in the morning, when she went to collect the breakfast tray that she had left outside Room 7 at 8 o'clock and which had not been touched. Room 7 was in the east wing. Edwin Pelham's wing. It was the largest of the guest rooms, with a view of the valley and a fireplace that actually drew properly, which at the Pelham put it in a class of its own. Its occupant, registered as one Arthur Kell, had been described in the register simply as business. He had arrived 2 days before the other guests, driven himself up the valley in a hired car that was now buried to its door handles, and had spent most of his time in his room or in the private sitting room that Dorothy Pelham normally kept locked. He had used the private sitting room. She had given him the key. This was, Miss Marple would later reflect, the detail that should have told her everything. But she was not yet in possession of it. Dorothy came into the sitting room where most of the guests had gathered with their morning tea and their various expressions of enforced patience, and she stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Miss Marple looked at her. Dorothy Pelham was a self-possessed woman. That much had been evident since the moment Miss Marple arrived. She was the kind of person who handled things, difficult guests, difficult boilers, difficult weather, with an efficiency that left no room for drama. But she was standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her face carrying the specific, careful stillness of someone who is deciding, very quickly, what to do next. "I need to call someone," she said, "and I'm afraid the telephone isn't working." Gerald Broom looked up from his crossword. "Mobile? Unreliable." She paused. "Mr. Kell in room 7 appears to have died in the night." There was a silence of the kind that fills a room from the edges inward. "Died," said Gerald Broom. "Yes," said Dorothy Pelham. Dr. Anton Feist was already standing. "I'll come up," he said. His voice had a new quality to it, not exactly calm, but precise in a way that was different from before. Miss Marple set down her teacup and followed. Room 7 smelled of old smoke and something else, something sweet and slightly chemical that Miss Marple identified slowly but with increasing certainty as she stood in the doorway while Dr. Feist went to the bed. Arthur Kell was a man of perhaps 65. His face, in death, had the composed, unsurprised look that some faces have. He was lying on top of the bed covers with his shoes still on, which was significant, and his right hand was closed around something, a key, it appeared, though the position of his fingers made it difficult to be certain. Dr. Feist bent over him with professional attention. He said nothing for a long time. "Heart," he said eventually. And then, more quietly, "Possibly." Miss Marple noticed the possibly. She noticed the key in his hand. She noticed the empty glass on the nightstand with the particular dryness at its rim that suggests something other than water. She noticed the window, which was not quite closed, and through which a thin, cold draft was making its way into the room. And she noticed, on the floor near the wardrobe, a small piece of paper that had been folded into quarters and which had clearly fallen from somewhere, a pocket most likely, and which had not been picked up. She left it where it was. In the corridor, Dorothy Pelham stood with her arms folded, not for warmth, but in the way people fold their arms when they are holding themselves together. "Did you know him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Before he came here, I mean." Dorothy Pelham said nothing for 3 seconds. "No," she said. It was the kind of no that contains a great deal. Chapter 5. A Key with No Door. The key in Arthur Kell's hand was not a room key. This was established when Dorothy Pelham, at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, compared it to the set of keys that hung in the kitchen. It was older than any of them, a proper iron key, the kind that belongs to a very old lock, with a bow that had been worn smooth by many hands, and a bit that had the particular pattern of a key made for a specific door rather than a manufactured type. Dorothy looked at it for a long time. Then she said, carefully, "I don't know what it belongs to." Miss Marple accepted this. She did not, necessarily, believe it. Dr. Feist had taken charge in the way that doctors do when they are the only doctor present, with authority that is entirely reasonable and yet somehow slightly too comfortable. He had advised that the body not be disturbed, that everyone should remain calm, and that as soon as the road's cleared, someone should contact the appropriate authorities. In the meantime, he suggested, they should all continue as normally as possible. Normally, said Harriet Broom. She looked at her husband. Gerald Broom was, for the first time since Miss Marple had met him, not eating anything. By midday, the guests had distributed themselves about the inn in the various ways that people distribute themselves when they are frightened but unwilling to admit it. Gerald and Harriet Broom sat together in the main sitting room with a pack of cards and the studied cheerfulness of a couple who have weathered things before. Dr. Feist disappeared into his room with what he called my notes. Theo went outside again to the stable block, which was clearly his retreat of choice. Orwell Crane did something interesting. He went to the hall and stood for a long time in front of the photograph of Edwin Pelham. Miss Marple, passing through the hall on her way to find more tea, paused to study her own coat on the hook beside the door, which gave her an entirely natural reason to remain in the hall and gave her eyes time to observe what they needed to observe. Orwell Crane was not merely looking at the photograph. He was, she decided, speaking to it. Not aloud, his lips were barely moving. But there was the quality of a man addressing someone he knew, rather than studying someone he did not. Then he turned and saw her, and his face did the thing that faces do when they are caught, a very rapid reorganization into something more neutral. Bad business, he said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Natural causes, the doctor thinks. He said possibly, said Miss Marple. Orwell Crane looked at her. Whatever he was deciding about her, it took him several seconds. Then he said, Did you notice the smell in the room? Yes, she said. I did. He nodded slowly. Almonds, he said. Faint, but there. Miss Marple looked at him with a kind of gentle attention. You have a good nose, Mr. Crane. I was a pharmacist, he said, for 32 years. He went back to the sitting room. Miss Marple went to find Celia Vane. She found her in the kitchen, helping Dorothy Pelham with lunch in the particular way of a person who needs something to do with their hands. Celia Vane was slicing bread, and she was doing it with a steadiness that required concentration. Miss Vane, said Miss Marple pleasantly, accepting a stool from Dorothy without asking for it. How did you come to be at the Pelham? Celia kept slicing. I read about it, she said, in a magazine. Country Inn, Derbyshire Hills. It sounded peaceful. And were you looking for peace? A pause just long enough to be noticed. Isn't everyone? Miss Marple smiled. I think most people who come to places like this are looking for something specific. Peace is a very general word for a very particular feeling. She paused. Do you know what Mr. Kell did for his living? Celia Vane put down the bread knife. Her hands, now still, were not quite steady. No, she said. I didn't know him at all. The bread knife was the kind with a curved handle, worn to a shine by years of use. It lay on the board between them, pointing at neither of them and both of them. Chapter 6. The Private Sitting Room. The folded piece of paper from Arthur Kell's room was, Miss Marple decided, the thing that needed to be addressed. She went back to room 7 at 1:30, when the inn had settled into the quiet of a house where everyone is having lunch or pretending to. The door was not locked. Dorothy had not locked it, which was either an oversight or a trust. Miss Marple suspected trust. Dorothy Pelham was the sort of woman who made her decisions once and didn't agonize over them. Arthur Kell lay exactly as he had been. Death in winter has a particular quality of stillness that goes beyond the ordinary. The window was still not quite closed, and the cold air was doing its patient work. Miss Marple picked up the folded paper from near the wardrobe. She unfolded it carefully, with the small hands that had unfolded many things over many years. It was a letter. Not all of it. The top of it had been torn away, so there was no greeting and no date. What remained was this. Understand that the matter of 1949 cannot be left as it is. Edwin made promises which were kept on one side and broken on the other. The deed is in the East Wing. in the room he called the counting room. The key you were given is the key you need. Do not let sentiment prevent what is right. There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice, folded it precisely as she had found it, and placed it in her cardigan pocket. Then she stood and looked at the room with a different quality of attention. The East Wing, built by Edwin Pelham in 1923. A room he called the counting room. She went looking for it. The East Wing had 6 guest rooms. She had been told this on the tour. She knew rooms 1, 2, and 3 from the corridor. Room 7, where Arthur Kell had died, was at the end. But between 5 and 7, the corridor did something odd. It angled slightly, unnecessarily, as though accommodating something behind the wall. Miss Marple walked the angle slowly, trailing her hand along the paneling. About midway along the angled section, her fingers found a join in the wood that was deeper than the others, a frame, rather than a panel, approximately 2 feet wide and perhaps 5 feet tall. A door, papered over on one side with wallpaper that matched the corridor exactly. It had been done carefully, but not recently. The paper over the join had shrunk slightly with age, making the seam just visible if you were looking. She tried the iron key. It fit. The counting room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10. It had no window. It had a wooden desk, a chair with a broken leg, and a shelving unit along one wall that held a number of metal boxes, all of them locked. The dust on the floor had been disturbed recently, a single set of footprints leading in and then out, the toe marks suggesting someone who had moved quickly. Someone had already been in here. Miss Marple looked at the boxes on the shelves. 14 of them. Each had a small label, written in a neat, old-fashioned hand. Some of the labels bore dates in the 1940s. Several bore names. One bore the name Crane. She did not touch it. She stood for a long moment in the dim, cold room that smelled of old paper and a man's ambitions, and then she went out and locked the door behind her and put the key in her cardigan pocket beside the letter. In the corridor, entirely still and apparently reading a notice about fire exits, stood Theo. Chapter 7. Theo's errand. He was very young to be so good at keeping his face empty. That was Miss Marple's first thought. Her second was that he was not in fact empty at all. He was very carefully full of something that he was working quite hard to keep inside. "You were in the stable block this morning," she said, very pleasantly. "I noticed the engine oil on your jacket at breakfast. Is there a vehicle in there?" Theo looked at her steadily. He had dark eyes and the kind of patience that is either born or earned in difficult circumstances. "A Land Rover," he said. "Mrs. Pelham's. I've been trying to get it started." He paused, "for when the road clears." "Thinking ahead," said Miss Marple. "Someone has to." She let a small silence go by. In her experience, young people, particularly young people keeping secrets, found silences harder to hold than older ones did. Older people had practice. Young people had energy going in all the wrong directions. "How long have you been working here?" she asked. 2 years. And then, because it was clearly simpler to say it than to let her get there herself, "Mrs. Pelham is my aunt. My mother's sister." "Oh," said Miss Marple, "how nice," and meant it, because family was interesting. "Did you know Mr. Kell?" The pause was less than a second, but it was there. "No. He arrived several days before the other guests," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "That's a long time to spend in one's room in a country inn in January. Unless one has a reason." Theo said nothing. "He was in the private sitting room," Miss Marple continued. "Your aunt gave him the key. I imagine she did not give that key to many people." Something moved in Theo's face, not quite guilt, something closer to sorrow. "He was a solicitor," he said. "He came about the will." Miss Marple looked at him. "Edwin Pelham's will?" "He died in 1952, Theo said. "The will was complicated. There are people who think some of what he left should have gone elsewhere." to other families. He stopped. I don't know the details. Aunt Dorothy doesn't talk about it. But Mr. Kell contacted her 2 months ago and said there were documents that needed to be examined. Documents in the East Wing, said Miss Marple softly. Theo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. I don't know anything about that, he said, and walked back toward the kitchen. He did know. And they both knew he knew. And he knew she knew. And she knew he knew she knew. The trouble with very young people, Miss Marple reflected, was that they sometimes underestimated how much older ones had already seen. The afternoon light was already beginning to fail. January days in Derbyshire were brief, hard-working things. Miss Marple went to her room and sat by the window and looked at the snow and thought about 1949 and Edwin Pelham, and a deed and a promise that had been kept on one side and broken on the other. She thought about Mr. Crane and his 32 years as a pharmacist and his very good nose. She thought about Celia Vane's still hands and her very expensive but not new dress. She thought about Dr. Feist and his imprecise eyes and his very precise beard and the way he had said possibly about Arthur Kell's death and then had not said it again. And she thought about the glass on the nightstand with its dry rim and the sweet chemical smell in the room, and the fact that a man who had come to examine documents had arrived at the inn holding an iron key that fit a hidden door. Who had given him the key? Not Dorothy Pelham. She had clearly not known what had opened. Then someone else had known. Chapter 8. Evening Arrangements. Dinner that evening was a different thing from the first night. The food was equally good. Dorothy Pelham's lamb and root vegetable pie was the sort of thing that makes the cold outside feel like a positive arrangement rather than a nuisance. But the room held a different temperature. People sat closer together than they had the night before, or further apart. There was no middle ground. Gerald and Harriet Broom sat very close together, their elbows touching. Gerald had put away the crossword, and Harriet had put away the particular manner of a woman managing a social situation, and what was left was two people who simply wanted to be in the same place. Dr. Feist sat at the end of the table near the window, apart from everyone. He ate with full attention to his food, which is either the sign of someone who finds eating meditative or someone who does not wish to meet anyone's eyes. Orwell Crane sat in the middle, as he had the night before, but something in him had reorganized itself. The previous evening he had been watchful. Tonight he was, Miss Marple searched for the word, resigned. As though a decision had been made, not necessarily his. Celia Vane was absent for 20 minutes, and then arrived and said she had had a headache and was better now, and sat with her hands in her lap and ate most of her pie. Theo served, which was unusual. Normally Dorothy handled everything herself or left things on the sideboard. But tonight he moved around the table with the focused care of someone who has been asked to do something specific and is doing it. He poured water and refilled bread baskets and did not look at Dr. Feist. Miss Marple noted that he did not look at Dr. Feist. Over the soup, Gerald Broom, who was perhaps braver than he looked, or perhaps simply could not bear the silence, said, I suppose we'll have to give a statement when the police get here. About last night, I mean. What everyone was doing. It seems likely, said Miss Marple. I was in bed, said Harriet Broom, in the tone of someone establishing this point firmly for the record. So was I, said Gerald. After 10. We had our cocoa, and that was that. Dr. Feist said, I was working in my room. Until quite late. On what? Asked Miss Marple pleasantly. Feist looked at her. My paper. For the conference. The conference in Sheffield, said Miss Marple. Yes. What is your field, Dr. Feist? A very small pause. Pharmacology, he said. The word sat at the table for a moment. Orwell Crane, who had been a pharmacist for 32 years, appeared to find something very interesting about his bread roll. Celia Vane, who was looking at her plate, lifted her eyes briefly to Dr. Feist and then put them back down. Theo, at the sideboard, did not turn around. How useful, said Miss Marple. In all sorts of situations. After dinner, she found Dorothy Pelham alone in the kitchen with the washing up and the tight, composed expression of a woman doing arithmetic in her head. Was Arthur Kell really a solicitor? Miss Marple asked. Dorothy Pelham turned to look at her. For a moment, the composure did what composures eventually do. He said he was. He had documents, letterhead. Everything looked correct. She turned back to the sink. He said my grandfather had made certain arrangements in 1949, before the war. Before, he was confused about dates. He meant 1939. Edwin signed a document of some kind, a deed of arrangement regarding this property. Mr. Kell said the deed named another party as co-owner, that this had been suppressed. She scrubbed at a pot. I didn't believe him, but you gave him the key to the private sitting room. I gave him access to the family papers. I wanted to see what he actually had. She paused. He was here 3 days. He found nothing. Or if he did, he didn't show me. And the other key? Miss Marple said, the iron one he had when he died? Dorothy Pelham was still for a long moment. I have never seen that key before in my life, she said. And the trouble was, Miss Marple believed her. Chapter 9. What Orwell Crane Knew. She found him at 11 o'clock at night, sitting alone in the small sitting room with a glass of whiskey and no light except the fire. The whiskey was barely touched. He looked up when she came in and did not seem surprised. Perhaps he had been waiting for someone. Perhaps for her specifically. May I? Miss Marple indicated the chair across from him. Of course, he said. Then you've been asking questions. I'm afraid I always do, she said. It's a habit, rather like your pharmacist's nose. He almost smiled. I knew Edwin Pelham, not well. My father knew him better. He stared at the fire, the kind of staring that means the fire is not what you are looking at. My father was a solicitor, he said, in Sheffield. He had a practice that dealt mostly with property and inheritance. In 1949, Edwin Pelham came to him with a problem. He had made an investment, a business partnership years earlier with a man called George Vane. They had put money together, a considerable sum, into property in the valley, 2 farms and this inn. When the partnership soured, Edwin kept everything. George Vane died in 1951, still believing he had been cheated. He paused. He had been. Another pause. My father drew up a deed of correction. Edwin signed it. It acknowledged the joint ownership. It was supposed to be registered. It never was. Why? Said Miss Marple. Orwell Crane looked at his hands. My father died in 1950. The practice was absorbed into another firm. Things got lost, or were made to get lost. I never knew which. He picked up his glass, put it down. I found out about the deed 3 years ago, when I was clearing out my father's things. A copy had been kept. I tracked down the other party's descendants, contacted them. George Vane's descendants, said Miss Marple. His granddaughter, Celia. He said the name carefully. She knew some of it already. Family stories, nothing solid. He looked at the fire. I arranged for Kell. He was a colleague of sorts, a proper solicitor. He was to examine the documents in the East Wing. I knew Edwin had kept records there, and establish what could be proven. You gave Kell the key. I had it from my father's effects. I didn't know what it opened until Kell found the room. A pause. He called me last week. Said he'd found the counting room in the boxes. Said the deed was there. Said he'd have everything in order within days. And then he died, said Miss Marple. Yes. Orwell Crane's voice was very quiet, very conveniently. Miss Marple looked at the fire for a moment. Dr. Feist, she said. How does he come into this? Crane was silent. Mr. Crane, she said gently, a man is dead. The roads will clear. The police will come. It is rather better for everyone, particularly for those with nothing to hide, if the situation is understood clearly before that happens. He said, Feist contacted Dorothy Pelham 2 weeks ago. He told her someone was planning to challenge the ownership of the inn. He offered to help. I don't know what his connection to the Pelham family is. But Dorothy knew him before this week. She didn't admit that to you, I imagine. Miss Marple sat quietly with this for a moment. No, Dorothy had not admitted that. Chapter 10. Dorothy Pelham's History. Dorothy was still in the kitchen. She had moved from the washing up to the bread making that she apparently did every night, a habit that looked like industry, but had, Miss Marple suspected, more to do with the steadying properties of repetitive physical work. Her hands were in the dough when Miss Marple came in. She didn't stop. You knew Dr. Feist before this week, Miss Marple said, sitting down at the kitchen table. Dorothy's hands kept working. He was at university with my cousin. I've known him 20-odd years. A pause. The dough turned, folded, turned again. When he contacted me about the challenge to the ownership, I asked him to come. I wanted someone who knew things, medical things, in case Kell turned out to have found what he was looking for. She stopped, looked at her hands. That sounds very bad. It sounds frightened, said Miss Marple, which is rather different. Dorothy looked at her. The composure was not gone. It was never entirely gone, but it was thinner than it had been. I did not poison Arthur Kell, she said. I want to be clear about that. I asked Anton here because I thought if someone with medical knowledge was present, and if Kell had found what he claimed to have found, and if he had some sort of accident, then there might be someone here who could make it seem She stopped. Natural, said Miss Marple. Yes. Dorothy sat down heavily. I didn't plan a death. I planned for insurance against what Kell might do. She rubbed her face with the back of her floury hand. Anton was supposed to be here in case I needed a medical opinion that was favorable. But I didn't do anything to cause the need for one. I swear it. Then, who did? Miss Marple asked. Very quietly. Dorothy looked at her hands. I don't know, she said. And this time, the not knowing had a different quality. Not the not knowing of someone hiding something, the not knowing of someone who has asked themselves the same question and found no answer they can bear. Tell me about Celia Vane, Miss Marple said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She wrote to me, she said at last. 6 months ago. Said she had reason to believe she had a claim on this property. Her grandfather and mine had been in business together. She asked to come and see the family papers. I refused. And then Kell came. And then all of this. A pause. She came anyway. She booked a room as a guest. I recognized her name from her letter. And you let her come. What was I to do? Tell her the road was closed? She to come later. They all would. Dorothy stood up. This property is all I have. My grandfather built it. My parents ran it. It is my life. I will not give half of it to someone I've never met because of something that happened before I was born. She said this with a conviction that was entirely understandable and not entirely simple. Miss Marple considered what she knew. A deed. A key. A hidden room. A man dead of something that was possibly natural and possibly not. A pharmacologist who had been invited by the owner. A retired pharmacist who had arranged for the dead man to come. A young woman who had a legal claim on the building around them. And the smell of almonds in a room. She went to bed at midnight and slept perfectly well, which she always found was the best thing to do when there was thinking left to be done. Chapter 11. The Morning Shift. The snow had stopped sometime in the night. Wednesday morning arrived crisp and brilliant, with a sky so blue it looked impractical and snow that caught the light and threw it back in handfuls. Miss Marple was up at 6. She had decided several things in the night. The first was that Arthur Kell had been murdered. The smell, bitter almonds, which is not quite the same as sweet almonds, but close enough to confuse if you are not a pharmacist of 32 years' experience or an elderly woman who once had a very interesting case involving a chemistry teacher in St. Mary Mead, was consistent with a cyanide compound. Not the dramatic quantity of mystery novels. A small amount, administered in a drink to a man with an already stressed heart. Enough to make natural causes entirely plausible. The second was that the deed still existed. The footprints in the counting room's dust showed that someone had entered it and left without taking anything, which meant either they hadn't found what they were looking for, or they had found it and decided not to take it yet. The third was that she needed to speak to Celia Vane alone and to Dr. Feist, and the order in which she did these things mattered. She found Celia in the garden, or rather, in the space that was a garden beneath the snow. Celia had put on her coat and her boots and gone out, which in January at 7 in the morning in Derbyshire requires either a clear head or a great deal to think about. She had both, Miss Marple suspected. She was standing at what had been the gate to the kitchen garden. The snow came to her knees. She had her face turned to the light. Miss Marple put on her own boots and coat and went out to join her, which was not entirely comfortable but was entirely necessary. "Your grandfather was George Vane," she said, coming to stand beside her. Celia didn't look at her. "He died when I was 3. I never knew him. But my mother, she used to say he'd been cheated. She wasn't bitter about it. She just mentioned it. The way you mention something that can't be changed. And then Mr. Crane found you. 3 years ago. He'd found a copy of the deed. He wanted me to know. He was very proper about it. He said it was my decision what to do." She turned slightly toward Miss Marple. "I didn't want to do anything at first. It seemed so long ago. And then I thought about my mother saying it and the way she said it, and I thought, well, it wasn't right, was it? What Edwin Pelham did." "No," said Miss Marple. "It wasn't." "I didn't come here to take anything from Dorothy Pelham," Celia said. Her voice was very steady. "I came because I wanted to see it. The place, where my grandfather's money went. I thought that if I understood it, if I saw it, I might know what I actually wanted to do." She paused. "And now someone's dead. And everyone thinks I might have killed him, and I have no idea who did. But I'm afraid." She stopped. "You're afraid it makes things worse for your claim," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm afraid it makes things worse for everything," Celia said. They stood in the snow for a moment, looking at the white garden. "Did you go to room 7 at any point on the night Mr. Kell died?" Miss Marple asked. "No," said Celia simply. "I was in my room from 9 o'clock. I read until midnight and then I slept. I know I can't prove it. But it's true." Miss Marple believed her. She went back inside to find Dr. Feist. Chapter 12. What Dr. Feist Had Not Said. He was in the dining room alone, at the far end of the table, with a cup of coffee and a notebook. The notebook was closed. He was sitting very still in the way of a man who is thinking rather than resting. He looked up when Miss Marple came in and did something interesting. He closed the notebook, which was already closed, and moved it slightly further away from him. The gesture of a person protecting something they are not holding. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. She sat down across from him without asking and poured herself coffee from the pot on the table. "Good morning," he said. He was watching her with those imprecise eyes, which were, at this hour, rather more precise than they had been at dinner. "I've been thinking about the glass in Mr. Kell's room," she said. "The one on the nightstand. Would you say it had contained water?" Feist was quiet for a moment. "It might have." The residue at the rim suggested something with a slightly higher viscosity, Miss Marple said pleasantly. "A cordial, perhaps, or a medicinal preparation of some kind." She looked at her coffee. Someone with a pharmacological background might have more precise thoughts. The silence was the kind that is chosen rather than fallen into. "I noticed the smell," he said at last. "When I examined the body. I didn't report it accurately because I was not certain what the appropriate course of action was. given the circumstances. Given that you had been invited by Dorothy Pelham, Miss Marple said, to be available in case a medical opinion was needed. He did not look surprised. He looked relieved, which was interesting. Yes, she asked you to be available to provide a supportive medical assessment, Miss Marple continued, if something were to happen to Kell that might appear ambiguous. She asked me to come, he said carefully. She told me there might be a situation requiring medical judgment. She did not specify what that situation would be. I came because, he stopped. Dorothy Pelham is not a criminal, he said. She was frightened. She's devoted her life to this place. I came because I thought I could be of genuine help if someone became ill. I did not come to cover up a murder. But when you found one, said Miss Marple, you were caught between your professional obligations and your friendship. He rubbed his face. Yes. The smell, she said, from your professional knowledge. Consistent with what? He looked at her directly for the first time. Potassium cyanide, possibly, in a very small concentration, combined with a cardiac condition that Kell apparently had. It would have looked, to most people, like a heart attack. But not to a pharmacologist, said Miss Marple. Not to a pharmacologist. He closed his eyes briefly. I should have reported it correctly from the beginning. Yes, said Miss Marple, not unkindly. You should have. But the question now is, who put it in his glass? And I think you and I both have thoughts about that. Feist looked at her. Dorothy. Dorothy Pelham has been here all her life, Miss Marple said. She knows every inch of this place. She is efficient and careful and not given to panic. But she invited you here as insurance, not as a weapon. If she had intended to kill Kell, she wouldn't have needed the insurance. The insurance tells me she was planning for something uncertain. Someone certain would not plan that way. Feist stared at his coffee cup. Then who? Miss Marple thought of Orwell Crane's 32 years as a pharmacist. She thought of Celia Vane's still hands. She thought of Theo's careful movements around the table at dinner, and the way he had poured everyone's water himself, and the glass he had specifically placed in front of Arthur Kell. She thought about family, and about what people do for the people they love. Chapter 13. The deed. She found the deed in the counting room at 11 o'clock in the morning, in the third metal box on the second shelf. The box was not marked Crane, as she might have expected. It was marked with a symbol only, a small letter P with a circle drawn around it, the sort of mark that a man puts on the things he considers privately his. The lock had already been picked, which interested her considerably. The mechanism was old and simple, and someone with the right tool and a steady hand could have managed it without much difficulty. The box held a collection of papers in a folder, and the folder held at its center a document of 4 pages, typed on a machine that had a slightly worn lowercase a, and signed at the bottom by 2 men. Edwin James Pelham, George Arthur Vane, and witnessed by 1 R.T. Crane, solicitor. It was a deed of joint ownership. The Pelham Inn and the 2 farms in the valley, held in equal shares, to pass in equal shares to lawful heirs upon the death of either party. It was dated the 14th of March, 1949. It had never been registered, and it had been kept here, in Edwin Pelham's own private room, in Edwin Pelham's own private box, for over 70 years. Miss Marple stood in the cold little room and looked at the document for a long moment. Then she carried it, carefully, under her arm, back down the corridor and the stairs, and into the kitchen, where Dorothy Pelham was making soup. She put the document on the table between them. Dorothy looked at it. Her face did not change in any dramatic way. It was more like the face of someone who has been waiting for a knock at the door for a very long time, and the knock has finally come. Is it real? She said. Yes, said Miss Marple. I believe it is. It will need a proper solicitor's assessment, but it appears to be genuine. She paused. There is also the question of who took Kell's copy, because he would have made a copy, and it's not in his room and not in the box. Dorothy sat down. The box had been opened before you found it, she said. Not a question. The lock had been picked, Miss Marple confirmed, rather recently. The scratches on the mechanism are fresh. Dorothy looked at the document, then at Miss Marple. The deed is half mine, she said, and half Celia Vane's, said Miss Marple. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The soup on the stove made small, patient sounds. Edwin, she said finally. He was my grandfather. I loved him. I didn't know he was this man. She touched the edge of the document, very lightly. What do I do? Miss Marple said, gently. I think that's a question for when the roads are clear and you have proper legal advice. But I'll say this. The right thing and the easy thing are not the same, and you already know which one you intend to do. I can see it in your face. Dorothy Pelham looked at her for a long moment. You've only known me 3 days, she said. People are very consistent, said Miss Marple. Chapter 14. The truth about Theo. She found him in the stable block, as she had expected. The Land Rover was running, had been running for some time, by the sound of it. Theo was sitting on an old wooden crate beside it, and he had the look of someone who has finished a task and is now waiting to discover what the task has cost him. He looked at her when she came in. He didn't say anything. The box had been picked, she said. She sat on another crate across from him. The engine ran steadily between them, and the stable smelled of old straw and diesel and the cold particular smell of stone in winter. The copy of the deed is missing, and the lock on the box was picked with something small and flat. A penknife, I'd guess. A pocket knife. Theo's jaw was tight. He didn't look away from her. You went into room 7, she said. On the night Kell died, after he was already dead. I think. You took the key from his hand, or perhaps from his pocket, and went to the counting room and picked the lock and took the copy of the deed. Theo said, he was already dead when I went in. I want you to understand that. I do, said Miss Marple. But that's not the whole of it, is it? The engine ran. The water, she said. At dinner. You poured everyone's water yourself. You were very careful about Mr. Kell's glass. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to lie, but the silence of someone deciding whether to live with the truth. I added something to his water, Theo said. His voice was very flat. I found something in Aunt Dorothy's things. I don't know exactly what it was. Something she'd been given. Or found. She didn't know I found it. I wasn't certain what it would do. I thought it would make him ill. I thought if he were ill, he'd go away. I didn't know he had a heart condition. He stopped. His face was very young and very old at the same time. I was trying to protect her, he said. This place is all she has. He was going to take half of it away. He had no right. He stopped again. I know that's not how it works. No, said Miss Marple quietly. It isn't. I didn't mean to kill him. His voice broke slightly on the last word, not dramatically, just the quiet fracture of a young man who has done something irreversible. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple looked at him for a long time. She thought about what she had seen in him from the beginning. The care, the protectiveness, the way he orbited his aunt like a satellite rather than a person with his own orbit. The engine oil on his jacket, the careful pouring of water, the footprints in the counting room. Where's the copy of the deed, she asked. I burned it, he said. In the stable stove. Last night. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It changed nothing, of course. The original was found. The deed was real. Celia Vane's claim was unchanged. He knew this too, she could see. He had done something irreversible for nothing, which was perhaps the worst part of all. The police will need to know, she said. All of it. You will need to tell Dorothy first, and you will need to do it before the road's clear, because when the police come, it will be better, rather better for everyone, if the facts are already understood. He looked at his hands. Will she? He couldn't finish. I don't know, said Miss Marple honestly, but she loves you. And the truth is always a better foundation than anything else, even when the truth is very bad. She left him sitting in the stable with the engine running and the smell of cold stone and diesel, and she walked back through the snow toward the inn. The snow was still brilliant in the morning light. A bird she couldn't identify was making a very small sound from the roof of the stable. The world was very quiet. Chapter 15. What Miss Marple Thought About. On the train. The roads cleared on Thursday, as Harold Fitch had predicted they would. He came with the taxi at 9:30 and loaded Miss Marple's brown suitcase and her large black handbag with the same laconic efficiency he had shown on the journey up, and drove her down the valley in the particular silence of a man who has heard things and will not say them. The police had come on Wednesday afternoon as soon as the main road opened. 2 officers from Buxton, sensible and thorough. They had spent 4 hours at the Pelham and taken statements from everyone. Theo had told them everything. Miss Marple had sat with Dorothy Pelham while he did. Dorothy had held Theo's hand and said nothing until he was finished, and then said, "He's my responsibility. He's been my responsibility since he was 14, and his mother died, and I was the only family left." Her voice had not shaken. The officers had taken Theo with them when they left. At the station in Wilverstone, the train was 10 minutes late. Winter service, the board said, which could mean anything, and Miss Marple sat on the platform bench with her bag on her lap and looked at the valley. It was beautiful. She had not had time to notice this properly until now. The hills were long and pale under the snow, with the particular quality of English hills that suggests they are not merely geographical features, but have opinions. The stone walls ran in dark lines down the slopes. The sky was the clear, cold blue of winter mornings that have decided to be honest. She thought about Edwin Pelham, who had built something lasting and beautiful, and had done it partly on someone else's foundation, and who had kept the proof of this in a locked room in a locked box for the rest of his life. She wondered what he had thought about it, whether it had troubled him, or whether the years had smoothed it into something he no longer examined. People were very good at not examining things. She thought about Orwell Crane, who had spent 3 years doing the right thing in a methodical, careful way, and who had not anticipated that the right thing might set other things in motion that ended badly. He had not killed anyone. He had not intended harm. But he had put a process in place and not considered all of its consequences, which was a different kind of responsibility, and one that she suspected he would carry quietly for a long time. She thought about Celia Vane, who had come looking for understanding and found more than she had bargained for, and who had, in the end, when it was clear what had happened, said only, "The last thing my grandfather would have wanted is for someone to be hurt because of this." Whether she meant it was something that only the future would settle. She thought about Dr. Feist, who had been in the wrong position for the right reasons and the wrong reasons at the same time, and who had in the end given the police a full and accurate account of the chemical evidence. His professional future was uncertain. His conscience, she suspected, was rather less so. And she thought about Theo, who was 22 and had done something terrible in the service of love, which was not the same as doing something terrible in the service of cruelty, but was not entirely different in its outcome. The law would deal with Theo. The law had its own kind of thoroughness. The Brooms, who had spent the whole thing feeling like characters in exactly the sort of mystery novel Harriet had invoked on the first evening, had gone home to London with the slightly dazed air of people for whom life has briefly exceeded its usual parameters. Gerald had finished his crossword. Dorothy Pelham had walked Miss Marple to the taxi with her back straight and her face composed. She had shaken Miss Marple's hand and said, "Thank you. I think." And then, the deed. "The solicitor says it's valid. I'll have to sort things out with Miss Vane. It's going to be very—" She had stopped. "Complicated," she finished. "Yes," said Miss Marple. but manageable. I think you'll manage it. Will I? It was not quite a question. You ran a country inn through a blizzard with a dead body in room 7 and solved the question of who put it there, Miss Marple said. I have no doubt about your capabilities at all. A very small smile had crossed Dorothy Pelham's face. Just briefly. The train arrived with the mild apology of a late train that knows it should have done better. Miss Marple settled into her seat with her bag and her cardigan, and the particular relief of a person heading home. The key was still in her cardigan pocket. She would post it back to Dorothy. She watched the valley recede through the window, the hills, the walls, the white and blue and stone of a January morning in Derbyshire, and she thought, as she often did at the end of things, not about the crime itself, but about all the smaller decisions that had led to it. The suppressed deed, the kept key, the loyalty that had curdled in Edwin Pelham into something that would last beyond his death and hurt people he would never meet. People did not, in her experience, set out to be the sort of person whose choices caused harm to strangers decades hence. They set out to protect what they had. They made a small compromise, and then another, and each one felt necessary in the moment. And the moments accumulated. What was interesting was not that people did such things. What was interesting was that the things almost always came to light eventually. The locked rooms opened. The deeds surfaced. The family stories, the ones passed down over kitchen tables, the ones told without bitterness, just as things that couldn't be changed, eventually found their way to solicitors and locked boxes and inn registers in January snowstorms. Truth, in Miss Marple's long experience, was rather like the Derbyshire hills. It did not announce itself. It was simply there, patient, large, and not going anywhere. Eventually, someone always looked up and saw it. She pulled out her knitting from her bag, a cardigan for Marjorie's baby, pale yellow, and settled into the rhythm of it as the train moved south. The tea trolley came at Sheffield. She had 2 sugars, which her doctor had told her not to, and a biscuit that was better than it had any right to be at this speed and altitude. Outside, England went by in its usual way. Fields, towns, a canal, a church tower, a school playground where children were chasing each other around a patch of leftover snow as though the snow were the best gift the week had offered, which for them it probably was. Miss Marple knitted. She thought, briefly, of Arthur Kell. She had not known him when he was alive and had only his dead face to go on, which was not much. But he had come to the Pelham Inn in good faith, with proper documentation and a genuine errand, and he had not deserved what had happened to him. That was important to remember. Amid all the complicated histories and competing claims and family loyalties and old deeds and new circumstances, there was a man who had come to do his job and had not gone home again. That was what murder was. Whatever its causes, whatever the pressures and fears that surrounded it, it was always, at its center, this. Someone who did not go home. The knitting needle clicked. The train went south. The baby's cardigan grew. Marjorie's letter had said February. Miss Marple thought she might write back and suggest January. The boiler situation, after all, was something that could be managed. Most things could. The hills of Derbyshire were already far behind her, and the light was the flat, gray, familiar light of the Midlands. And Miss Marple was already thinking, not about what had happened, but about what came next, which was, she had always found, the only sensible thing to do.